In Salman Rushdie's novel, Shalimar the Clown, he presents the deterioration of Kashmir from a place where Muslims and Hindus could live together in peace and cooperation to a country ravaged by conflict. This descent is signalled early on in the novel with the arrival of a character called the Iron Mullah, a blood and thunder preacher with the skin the colour of rusting metal. He is a frightening and ridiculous figure, but because he has power, everyone's too afraid to laugh. Shalimar the Clown has always been my favourite Rushdie novel, partly because it captures the tragedy of what happened in Kashmir so poignantly. Rushdie's depiction of the country's degeneration from an ecumenical paradise to a sectarian war zone is heartbreaking. It was published in 2006, 17 years after the fatwa issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran after the publication of Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses, and it's clear that his experiences have informed his portrayal of the Iron Mullah. Religious extremism and intolerance is something that Rushdie has had to live with for most of his life. Whereas extremists cannot reason and therefore resort to violence, Rushdie's power has always been in his words. In recent years, we've seen attempts by activists of many stripes to conflate words and violence, to claim that they are one and the same thing, and that offensive words can be harmful. But this is not true, and a society that values the liberty of its citizens will take care to preserve the distinction. Look at what happened at the Batley Grammar School last year. A teacher who had shown a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad during a lesson was suspended for causing offence, even though the lesson was about free speech, and soon after went into hiding following death threats. Protesters gathered outside the school and stated they would not disperse until he was sacked. And consider their complaints. They talked about their safety and well-being. One protester, arrogantly claiming to speak on behalf of the Muslim community, read out a statement in which the school authorities were accused of failing in their duty of safeguarding, and the teacher himself was charged with threatening and provocative behaviour, and the teacher's still in hiding. So who is the real victim here? For all their talk of safeguarding, the protesters seem to be oblivious to a far more dangerous trend, that as a result of the various Islamist terrorist attacks in recent years, from the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo offices in January 2015 to the beheading of schoolteacher Samuel Paty in October 2020, the right to criticise and ridicule religion has been increasingly under threat. And now, 33 years after the fatwa, and Salman Rushdie is in hospital fighting for his life, having been repeatedly stabbed by a man at an event in New York. Although the police have yet to confirm a motive, a review of the suspect's social media accounts has suggested that he is supportive of extremist Islamic movements. And now, of course, the responsibility ultimately lies with Rushdie's assailant. But I can't help but think that we as a society failed the test of upholding artistic freedom at the time of the fatwa in 1989. Now, I was very young, but I remember the debates and the equivocation. I remember my RE teacher at school saying that Rushdie shouldn't have written such an offensive book. I remember scenes on the news of men burning the Satanic Verses on the streets of Bradford. But there were some brave public figures who defended Rushdie. So Susan Sontag was president of PEN America at the time, and with a group of other writers, she arranged public readings of the Satanic Verses. This took some courage. There had been threats. Bookshops had been firebombed because they stocked the novel, even in London. The book's Japanese translator was stabbed to death, and an Italian translator seriously wounded. After the massacre in 2015 at the offices of Charlie Hebdo, PEN America awarded the magazine a Freedom of Expression Award. But then 35 writers signed a letter protesting against the decision on the grounds that the cartoonist had mocked a, quote, section of the French population that is already marginalised, embattled and victimised. And this is the very same victim-blaming attitude we continually find in our society, where those who cause offence with their artistic choices are seen as somehow responsible for the violent repercussions. After Charlie Hebdo, world leaders pronounced "Je suis Charlie." That lasted about 5 minutes. Then we all went back to how all these cartoonists shouldn't have been drawing Muhammad in the first place. But why not? They weren't Muslims. Most of them didn't even believe in God. This is what Charb, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, wrote in a little book that he completed just 2 days before he was murdered. A religion is nothing more than a collection of texts, traditions and customs that it is perfectly legitimate to criticise. Sticking a clown nose on Marx is no more offensive or scandalous than popping the same schnoz on Muhammad. And yet are those who want to strengthen existing hate speech laws to ensure that religion is ring-fenced from criticism and ridicule. And this is appeasement. It's the very first step on a very dangerous path. Religious zealots with submachine guns don't require legal protection from cartoonists. But all of this was prefigured in the Rushdie affair and the way in which so many in the public eye tried to blame the author for his own fatwa because he chose to write a book. And if you haven't read the Satanic Verses, I suggest that you do, not because of the controversy, but because it's one of his best books. It's really about the immigrant experience of living in London, but with Rushdie's touch of magical realism. It has one of the most audacious openings of a novel I've ever read, with the two principal characters falling from the sky from an exploded jumbo jet, dancing and singing deliriously as they tumble towards London. The book is exhilarating, moving, and frequently funny. I can't help but notice how many of Rushdie's critics seem to lack that all-important sense of humour. And it was actually a subplot of the book, sequences based on the founding stories of Islam, that caused the offence. But this wasn't really about people reading a book and being offended by its contents. This was about Philistines who hadn't read the book and who were offended because some iron mullah had told them that they should be. Here's the singer Yusuf Islam, formerly known as Cat Stevens, appearing on the Australian television show Hypotheticals soon after the fatwa was declared. He'd already stated by this point that he felt Rushdie deserved to die, and then he was asked what he would do if he were to encounter Rushdie in public.
I'd try to phone the Ayatollah Khomeini and tell him exactly where this man is.
Would you go to a demonstration where you knew that an effigy was going to be burnt?
I would have hoped that it'd be the real thing, but actually, no, if it's just an effigy, I don't think I'd be that moved to go.
In a civilised and free society, it shouldn't be difficult to reach a consensus that violence is not an appropriate form of literary criticism, or that one of the most important novelists of our time should be entitled to write or say whatever he pleases. But we didn't reach that consensus, did we? Instead, we let the iron mullahs win. We didn't do anywhere near enough to stand up to a foreign theocratic government putting a bounty on the head of a British citizen. We failed to be unanimous in our condemnation of those who were burning books and calling for authors to be killed. We said that if you feel offended, then the person who caused the offence is to blame. Consider the discussions when Salman Rushdie was awarded a knighthood in 2007. Shirley Williams had this to say on Question Time.
We're not very wise to do it in that way. This is a man who is deeply offended Muslims in a very powerful way, who's been protected by the British police against threats of suicide for years and years, at great expense to the taxpayer. And frankly, I think that it was not wise and not very clever to give him a knighthood.
Christopher Hitchens.
I think that's a contemptible statement, and I think everyone who applauded it should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves.
He may not have approved of the phrase, but thank God for Christopher Hitchens. And when it comes to freedom of expression, we all need to be a little braver. We need to remind those who are offended that their offence is their own business. They don't get to decide what other people should or should not read, which cartoons should or should not be drawn, which ideas should or should not be ridiculed or critiqued. This is from Rushdie's memoir. It's a letter to a reader. Thank you for your kind words about my work. May I make the elementary point that the freedom to write is closely related to the freedom to read, and not have your reading selected, vetted and censored for you by any priesthood or outraged community. Since when was a work of art defined by the people who didn't like it? The value of art lies in the love it engenders, not the hatred. It's love that makes books last. Please keep reading. And that's exactly what we need to do. Keep reading, in spite of those iron mullahs of the world who would force us to stop.